This is my true story. I spent my life raising one son in Nashville, Tennessee, working hard, saving every penny, believing love would circle back in time. But one evening, after all the years of giving, he opened the trash bin and fed me what was left inside. That moment changed everything. I didn't shout. I didn't plead. I simply watched, and then I acted. 1 week later, a single letter would teach him the taste of regret. Before I tell you what I did, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And please subscribe so my stories reach more hearts like yours. I grew up in the kind of South where hard work wasn't a choice. It was the only way life made sense. My hands learned to build before they ever learned to rest. In my 20s, I worked construction by day and repaired engines by night, saving every spare dollar in a rusted Folgers can under the kitchen sink. I didn't drink much, didn't gamble, didn't wander far from home. I just kept stacking the quiet years, one long day after another, until that stack turned into a life. When my boy was born, the world seemed to tilt toward light. He came early, small enough to fit in one arm, but loud enough to fill the whole hospital room. The nurse laughed and said he had a singer's lungs. Well, we were only a few miles from the Grand Ole Opry, so maybe the sound carried in the blood. From the moment I held him, I promised myself that no matter how poor or tired I became, he'd never go hungry, never go cold. I used to leave the house before sunrise, heading toward job sites out near Murfreesboro or Franklin. I'd pack a bologna sandwich and a thermos of black coffee, and before I closed the door, I'd always check on him, tiny, wrapped in a faded blanket, breathing soft as a prayer. That picture never left me. Every nail I drove, every hour I sweated through Tennessee heat or January frost, I did it thinking of that sleeping child. His mother, God rest her soul, was the heart of the home. She'd hum while cooking beans, sometimes singing old Patsy Cline tunes, and I swear the whole place would smell like forgiveness. When she passed, the boy was only 13. I remember standing at her graveside at Mount Olivet Cemetery, the church bells echoing off the hills, and thinking, "It's just you and me now, son. We'll take care of each other." Those next years weren't easy. Teenagers want the world to move faster than love can catch up. But I gave him everything I knew: steady hands, patience, and the belief that a man's worth was measured by how he treated those who couldn't fight back. He liked numbers, not tools, so I used what little savings I had to send him to business school in Knoxville. Watching him leave for college, suitcase in hand, was both pride and heartbreak rolled into one. Every month, I mailed him a small check, even when it meant skipping meals or pushing off my own doctor visits. I'd tell myself it was worth it. Education was the road I never had the chance to walk. I figured if he learned about money, he'd learn to respect what it costs to earn it. When he graduated, I was the loudest one cheering in that cold auditorium. He hugged me once, quick, embarrassed maybe, but I didn't mind. I could have left right then and felt like life had given me everything it owed. He soon landed a job downtown at a finance firm, sharp suit, shiny shoes, the kind of man people call "Sir" before they know his age. He'd take me out sometimes, to diners off Broadway or barbecue joints near East Nashville, and I'd sit there proud, listening to him talk about deals and clients. It made me happy, seeing him become what I'd dreamed for him. The house stayed small, but he filled it with big talk: new cars, better houses, opportunities. I didn't understand half the words he used, but I smiled anyway. That's what fathers do. We listen, even when the language of the next generation sounds like a foreign song. Over time, he started to pull away, as children often do once they think they've outgrown the soil they came from. Calls got shorter, visits came with excuses. Still, I defended him when neighbors asked why he never came around. "He's busy," I'd say. "The boy's working hard." In truth, I was the one working, just to keep believing that success hadn't changed his heart. Years rolled on, and my back began to stiffen with age. Climbing stairs felt like lifting years one at a time. My doctor said I needed to eat better, rest more, but meals taste different when you're eating alone. So, when my son offered for me to move in with him, I said yes, with more gratitude than words. I thought, maybe this is how love circles back. His house in Brentwood was big, too big for warmth maybe, but it smelled of new paint and money. I told myself I'd adjust. I kept quiet, made myself small, like a guest who doesn't want to overstay. I cooked simple things, kept to my room, watched old westerns when nobody was home. Some nights, though, I'd hear laughter from the living room. His friends, loud, carefree. I'd smile to myself, thinking of how far he'd come. I always believed that food is more than fuel. It's memory. Every dish I ever cooked for him carried a story. Cornbread from the night we lost power, fried catfish from the summer he caught his first one on the Cumberland River, the stew his mother used to make when bills were tight. Those meals stitched us together through the years. So even when I grew old and slow, I never imagined the act of feeding could turn cruel. Still, I stayed grateful. I thanked him for everything, the roof, the space, the company. Gratitude, I thought, was the only language left between us. I didn't notice the small sighs, the rolling eyes, the tapping fingers when I asked for something. Maybe I didn't want to. One Sunday afternoon, he came home from work in a foul mood. His voice was sharp, clipped, the kind that cuts before you realize you've been wounded. I offered to make dinner, but he waved me off, said he'd handle it. I nodded, took my pills, and sat quietly in the corner, waiting for the smell of food. When none came, I decided I'd just fix myself something small later. That night, I realized love can fade so quietly you don't hear it leave. But before that final insult, before the night when everything changed, I still held hope. I kept remembering the boy who used to sit on my lap eating biscuits right out of the oven, butter melting down his chin. I'd think about the afternoons when we'd watch football together, cheering for the Titans and laughing when they lost anyway. Those memories were my shelter, the proof that kindness once lived here. You see, when you've given someone everything, you convince yourself they'll remember. You tell yourself the bond you built is stronger than pride, stronger than time, stronger even than disappointment. That's what I believed every morning when I made his coffee, folded his laundry, and thanked him for letting me stay in the house I once helped him buy. I thought about my own father, a coal worker from Kentucky, who used to tell me, "Son, when you feed someone, you give them a part of your soul. Make sure they never throw it back." Back then, I never understood. Now, sitting in that quiet house in Nashville, I did. The day he fed me those leftovers from the bin didn't come from nowhere. It came from years of small cruelties left unchecked, forgotten birthdays, empty chairs at Christmas, words said in impatience that never got unsaid. It's never one big betrayal that breaks a parent's heart. It's the 1,000 little ones that pile up until love has nowhere left to sit. Yet, even with all the disappointment, my heart refused to turn bitter. Maybe that's what fatherhood does. It trains you to forgive the unforgivable, at least until you can't anymore. I still prayed for him at night, still asked God to soften him, still told myself that maybe work stress or loneliness made him cruel. But the truth is, some people grow out of love the way trees outgrow their roots. They forget who kept them standing. Looking back now, I realize my devotion wasn't a weakness. It was my foundation. Everything I am, the patience, the endurance, the quiet, came from that place of love. That's why I didn't react with shouting or vengeance. I wanted justice, not noise. I wanted to teach, not destroy. And so, the moment he handed me that cold, shameful meal from the trash, my devotion didn't die. It transformed. It became something sharper, wiser, clothed in silence. The years of care had given me more than a son. They'd given me leverage, because behind all that love were papers, deeds, accounts, all still signed in my name. But that's for later. Before the letter, before the regret, there was this. A man who gave everything he had to his child, believing kindness would come full circle. And maybe, in some strange way, it did. Just not the way either of us expected. I started noticing the cracks slowly, the way an old fence splits not from one storm, but from years of quiet neglect. It began with tone, the sound in his voice when he spoke to me. It wasn't anger, not yet. Just a kind of weariness, like every word I said was one more grain of dust on his patience. At first, I told myself it was stress. Nashville's pace had changed. The city that once felt slow and honest now ran on caffeine, deadlines, and ambition. People my son's age moved fast, talked fast, and lost patience even faster. Maybe that was it, I thought. Maybe it wasn't me. But then came the little things. Meals that used to be shared became quiet affairs of distance. He'd sit at the far end of the table, scrolling on his phone while I tried to talk about the weather, the Titans game, or the new park they were building downtown. His replies grew shorter, sometimes just a nod. Other times, nothing at all. I learned to stop talking. I'd eat quietly, fold my napkin, and retreat to my room before he noticed the silence between us. It's strange how humiliation creeps in like humidity. Thick, invisible, heavy. You don't feel it right away, but over time, it soaks everything. I'd wake up early, make coffee, and try to leave a note saying I'd made enough for both of us. By the time I came back from the porch, the pot would be empty, the note gone. He wasn't cruel enough to say anything, but he didn't have to. Indifference is its own form of cruelty. One Saturday morning, I tried to help around the house. Small things, folding laundry, cleaning the porch steps. I thought maybe he'd see effort and remember gratitude. Instead, he sighed and said I was in the way. That one phrase followed me for weeks, in the way, as if my whole existence had turned into an obstacle course in his perfect life. I used to visit the local grocery store, the same Kroger I'd been going to for 30 years, just to talk to someone who remembered my name. The cashier, an older woman named Patty, would smile and ask how my son was doing. I'd tell her he was fine, successful, busy. I never mentioned the cold air at home, the invisible wall that had grown between us. Some things are too shameful to say out loud. What hurt most wasn't what he said, but what he stopped doing. No more asking how I slept. No more offers to watch a ball game. Even birthdays became text messages with no voice, no warmth, just an obligation fulfilled. I'd get a "Happy birthday, Dad" at noon, typed without punctuation, followed by silence. I used to save those messages anyway, just to reread them when nights got lonely. I guess old men hold on to scraps of love the way others hold on to keepsakes. Sometimes I'd take a walk down to Centennial Park, sit by the lake, and watch the ducks drift under the reflection of the Parthenon. It reminded me of the times I used to take him there as a kid. He'd throw breadcrumbs into the water, laughing every time the ducks fought over them. Now, sitting alone, I realized I was still throwing crumbs, only now they were emotional, invisible ones, trying to feed a bond that no longer existed. He had a girlfriend then, young, polished, the kind who used words like aesthetic and career path. She never looked me in the eye for long. I think to her, I was a reminder of something she wanted to forget: age, patience, humility. She'd visit the house and talk loudly about real estate and investments while I sat in the corner, nodding politely. Sometimes she'd bring dinner, but there was always just enough for two. I learned quickly not to expect a plate. When I tried to join a conversation once, offering a simple story about how I built our old home with my hands, she smiled the kind of smile people use when they want you to stop talking. My son laughed awkwardly, changed the subject, and poured her more wine. That was the first time I felt truly invisible in my own family. One evening, I asked if he wanted to visit his mother's grave. It had been years since he'd gone. He hesitated, said he was too busy. That cut deeper than anything else. She had loved him more than anyone alive, and he couldn't spare a few minutes. I ended up going alone, sitting beside her stone in Mount Olivet, brushing away fallen leaves. I told her he was doing well, that he was happy, that I was proud. I lied through my teeth, but that's what parents do, protect their children, even from the truth. After that, the distance wasn't just emotional, it became physical. He'd stay out late, leave early, barely say goodbye. I'd hear his car engine in the driveway and feel both relief and dread. Relief that he'd come home safe. Dread that the silence would continue. The house grew colder, not in temperature, but in spirit. There's something about living with someone who's ashamed of you. You start to shrink without realizing it. You move quieter. You breathe softer. You take up less space, hoping they'll forget you're there. I used to hum when I cooked breakfast, an old habit from the days when his mother was alive, but I stopped. The sound irritated him. He said it was distracting. So I stopped humming. I stopped asking about his day. I stopped existing loudly. The last straw came one morning when I made pancakes, just like I used to when he was a boy. The smell filled the kitchen. Butter, maple, memory. He walked in, looked at the counter and said, "I don't eat this stuff anymore." No thank you. No smile. Just that. Then he left for work, leaving the pancakes to grow cold. I threw them out later, though I saved one and ate it alone, just to remember what love used to taste like. Over the next few weeks, the pattern hardened. I became part of the furniture, something to dust around. He'd bring friends over, laughing, drinking, talking loudly about money and power. I'd stay in my room, door half closed, listening to my own heartbeat drown in their noise. Sometimes I'd hear my name, always in past tense. Yeah, Dad used to do that. Or, he doesn't get how things work now. They spoke of me like I was already gone. One night, after they left, I stepped into the living room. Empty glasses, cigarette butts, the faint smell of whiskey. I picked up the mess quietly, one cup at a time. In that silence, I realized something profound. I wasn't living there anymore. I was haunting it. You can tell when a house stops being a home. It's not when the pictures come down or when the lights go out. It's when your presence stops meaning something. That's when I knew. I was still alive, but in his world, I was already gone. I'd seen neighbors go through similar heartbreaks. Older parents discarded like furniture. They'd whisper about it at the diner on West End Avenue. One man, a retired mechanic, told me his daughter moved him into a nursing home because his stories were too long. I laughed then, but the laugh caught in my throat. I realized how close I was to becoming him. There was one evening I'll never forget. I was watching the sunset from the porch, the kind of golden Tennessee dusk that makes everything glow like memory. He came home, saw me there, and asked me to move my chair because it blocked his view from the living room window. That's when I knew respect had left completely. He wasn't seeing me anymore, just something in his way. So I started preparing quietly. Not for revenge, not yet, but for preservation. I began sorting through old files, the ones in the wooden cabinet by my bed, bank statements, property deeds, ownership papers for the family business I'd built years ago. He didn't know, but my name was still on most of them. He thought because he managed it now, he owned it. That was his mistake, assuming possession meant power. I began to write notes, not angry letters, but reminders to myself. Do not beg for love. Dignity is not negotiable. I pinned one on the wall above my desk, beside a picture of him as a boy. In that picture, he was laughing, holding a fishing rod at Radnor Lake. His eyes were bright, proud. I stared at that photo every night, wondering how those same eyes had turned cold. The first disrespect had already planted the seed of what would come next. Every insult, every sigh, every moment of being treated like a burden was adding up to something heavier than anger. Clarity. I realized that the son I'd raised was gone, replaced by a man who measured worth in convenience, and I, his father, had become inconvenient. I didn't confront him. I didn't lecture him. The time for words had passed. I simply waited, quietly, like the way seasons change. Slow, certain, unseen. I knew that soon enough he'd cross a line so deep that no bridge could ever reach across it. And when that moment came, when he handed me that shameful meal from the trash, I wasn't surprised. I'd already felt it coming for years, one small cruelty at a time. The truth is, disrespect never arrives suddenly. It knocks gently first. Then, when you fail to stop it, it walks right in and makes itself at home. That's how my story really began, not with a meal from the bin, but with a sigh across the table, a cold stare, and the slow death of love in the house I once built with my own 2 hands. It was a Tuesday evening, one of those sticky Tennessee nights when the air feels heavy even after sundown. The sky outside was the color of rust, and the cicadas hummed like they were trying to fill a silence that no one wanted to break. I remember because I was sitting on the porch, watching the light fade over the neighbor's fence, sipping what was left of my lukewarm coffee. The day had been quiet, slow, like most of them lately. My joints hurt a little more than usual, but I'd gotten used to that. Pain becomes background noise when you live long enough. I could hear my son moving around inside, talking on the phone, his voice sharp, hurried, the way people talk when they care more about winning than listening. It wasn't always clear what he was arguing about. But money was the rhythm of his life now. Deals, clients, deadlines, and somewhere in that chaos, the word family had been lost. I waited for him to finish before stepping back inside. The kitchen light was harsh, the kind that makes everything look colder. There were takeout boxes on the counter, the kind from that chain restaurant downtown he liked. I saw the lid open on one. Soup, half-eaten, still warm. My stomach tightened. I hadn't eaten since noon, just toast and black coffee. I figured I'd ask if there was some left, maybe warm it up and sit with him for a bit. It sounds small, but for someone like me, that's how you try to hold on, through little quiet gestures. I walked in slowly, not wanting to interrupt his mood. He didn't look up, just scrolled on his phone, shoulders tight. I asked gently if there was any soup left, maybe enough for a small bowl. He didn't answer right away. When he finally did, he didn't even look at me. He said something that cut through the room like a blade. "There's food in the trash, Dad. You can have that." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. The words didn't make sense. Food in the trash. My mind replayed it again and again, trying to find the version where it was a joke or a misunderstanding. But his tone left no room for either. He'd meant it, every word. He pushed his chair back, walked over to the bin, and with a smirk that didn't belong to the boy I raised, lifted the lid. Inside, there was the container, a few scraps of cold soup, bits of bread soggy with oil. He pulled it out, set it on the counter like it was nothing. The smell hit me first. Sour, metallic, a reminder that even food has dignity until someone strips it away. I stood there, frozen. My hands shook a little, not from anger yet, but from something heavier, disbelief. He looked at me like he was waiting for a reaction. Maybe he wanted me to argue, to shout, to remind him I was still a man and not a ghost in his house. But I didn't. I just stared at that container, the steam long gone, and thought about the nights I'd gone hungry years ago to make sure he didn't. I remembered the winters when I'd shovel snow until midnight so he'd have Christmas presents under the tree. The summers I'd work in the sun just to afford his tuition. Every sacrifice felt like it was standing in that kitchen with me, watching what love had turned into. I didn't touch the food. I didn't say a word. I turned, walked to the sink, and ran my hands under cold water just to feel something that wasn't shame. He laughed once, a dry sound that didn't sound human. Then he left the room, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the house that used to hold warmth. When the door to his room shut, the silence fell thick again. I stood there for a long while, staring at that plastic container sitting on the counter. It looked small, insignificant, but it might as well have been a gravestone for the man I used to be in his eyes. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same one where he used to do his homework when he was little. I could still see the scratches from where he'd carved his initials into the wood. I used to get angry about that once. Now, I wished he'd left more marks, anything to remind me that love had lived here once. The air was heavy, still. Somewhere outside, a dog barked. I thought about the smell of his mother's cooking, how she used to make soup that filled the whole house with warmth. She'd laugh when he spilled it, wipe his chin, tell him he'd grow into a fine man one day. I wished she could have seen what he'd become. Maybe she would have known how to reach him. Maybe she would have known how to stop him before cruelty became habit. I sat there until the clock on the wall hit midnight. The soup had gone cold, a dull film forming over the surface. I didn't throw it out. I just covered it, put it in the fridge. Somehow, it felt wrong to waste even that. Old habits die hard. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow, its shadow cutting across the room like a pendulum. Every rotation reminded me of years, the years I gave him, the years he'd taken for granted. My chest felt tight, not from age but from the weight of disappointment. When I finally did drift off, I dreamed of simpler times, of holding his hand while crossing the street, of him laughing, ice cream dripping down his chin, running toward me shouting, "Dad!" The sound of that word in the dream was so pure, so full of life, that I woke up crying. Morning came pale and dull. I moved quietly, as always, made coffee, toasted some bread, and left his breakfast plate empty. I didn't bother waking him. There was nothing left to say. I took my cup outside, sat on the porch, and watched the sun climb over the rooftops. Nashville was waking up, traffic humming in the distance, life going on as if the world hadn't just ended in one small kitchen the night before. As I sipped my coffee, I thought about what that moment had truly meant. It wasn't just an insult about food. It was a statement. It was him saying, "You don't matter." The meal was just the vessel. The real poison was the message behind it. That was the morning I stopped being his father in practice, even if not in name. Something inside me had broken clean through. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the loud, fiery way. My anger had turned cold, like steel, sharp, precise, and behind it, there was clarity. When you've lived long enough, you learn that revenge is not about shouting, not about matching cruelty with cruelty. It's about balance. It's about restoring what was taken, not by hurting, but by correcting. And in that moment, I realized that the years of quiet patience had given me everything I needed to correct this one final wrong. That night of humiliation didn't just end my hope in him. It birthed my resolve. The slap of that soup container on the counter still echoed in my ears, but so did the quiet hum of resolve forming beneath it. I didn't have youth anymore, but I had something stronger: experience, control, and the law on my side. By the next sunrise, my heart had already decided. If he could treat me like something to be discarded, then I would show him what happens when the one he dismissed holds the strings he doesn't even see. I didn't eat breakfast that morning. Instead, I put on my old jacket, the one still smelling faintly of sawdust and thyme, and took a slow walk down the road. The air was cooler than usual, crisp, with that faint scent of honeysuckle carried in from somewhere behind the fences. It felt like the start of something new, though I couldn't name it yet. I walked to the post office, then to the small cafe I used to visit with his mother on Sundays. The waitress there, an older woman named Eileen, smiled when she saw me. "Haven't seen you in a while," she said. I smiled back, small and tired. "Just needed a change of scenery," I told her. She poured my coffee without asking. As I sat there, stirring cream into the cup, a thought settled over me like the first chill of winter. Maybe love isn't about how much you give. Maybe it's about knowing when to stop giving before you disappear entirely. When I finished my coffee, I headed toward my lawyer's office downtown. The city moved around me, cars honking, people rushing, all unaware that inside one old man, a storm had begun to turn. That night of humiliation was my awakening, the last drop that made the cup overflow. The pain of it was sharp, but beneath the sting was something almost holy, the understanding that I could still act, still decide, still shape the ending of my own story. And when the time came, I would do just that. The days that followed were quieter than ever, though not in peace. More like the kind of silence that sits in a room after something has died. Nashville moved along outside my window, cars honking, neighbors mowing lawns, church bells ringing on Sunday. But inside the house, everything felt hollow. It was like the walls themselves had witnessed too much and didn't know what to say. I kept to myself, moving slower, speaking less, breathing softer. It's strange how quickly a man can turn invisible when someone decides he no longer matters. I began rising before dawn, long before my son woke. The world at that hour was still mine, just me. The faint hum of crickets fading into the sound of trucks rolling down I-40, and the smell of dew on the grass. I'd make a small pot of coffee, pour one cup, and sit by the kitchen window. That was my ritual. The sun would rise over the rooftops, and I'd pretend that the day ahead might hold something kind. Pretending is easier than admitting you've been erased. I stopped trying to eat at the same table. Meals had turned into quiet performances of avoidance, him glancing at his phone, me pretending not to notice. Sometimes he'd leave without saying a word. Sometimes he'd toss a few bills on the counter like payment for something he didn't owe. I didn't need his money. What I needed was the simple respect of being seen. But respect, once it leaves, rarely finds its way back. In the evenings, I'd take slow walks down the block toward the Cumberland River. I liked the way the water looked at sunset, smooth, endless, steady. It reminded me that time moves forward whether you're ready or not. The older couples I passed would nod politely, but I could see the quiet recognition in their eyes, that unspoken understanding older people share when they see loneliness wearing familiar clothes. At home, I began cleaning drawers, sorting through papers, and organizing old files. To anyone else, it might have looked like boredom, but it was something else entirely. It was preparation. Every document I touched felt like a piece of my life I was reclaiming. Property deeds, tax returns, ownership certificates, they were all still under my name. My son never bothered with them. He'd assumed everything belonged to him simply because it always had. He'd forgotten the truth. I had built it all long before he ever existed. That quiet work gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in years. Each file I organized was a reminder that I wasn't powerless, just patient. Power doesn't always look like anger. Sometimes it looks like calm hands and a steady breath. In those long silent days, I started noticing the small details of life again, things I'd once taken for granted. The way sunlight fell through the blinds and cut across the floorboards like golden ribbons. The hum of cicadas after rain. The smell of wet soil drifting in from the backyard after a thunderstorm. Those things became my company. They didn't interrupt, didn't judge. They just existed, like me. I also found comfort in small places, the old diner near Nolansville Pike, where the same waitress still called everyone sweetheart. I'd sit at the corner booth with my notebook, order black coffee and scrambled eggs, and watch people rush in and out. Families laughing, couples arguing softly, old men like me reading the paper. I used to take my son there when he was little. He loved their pancakes. Now I sat alone, surrounded by ghosts of mornings past. I started writing again. Not long letters, just small reflections on folded notebook paper. Lines like, "The cruel forget the weight of memory," or, "Some storms don't need thunder. Some come quietly, wearing the face of someone you love." I never intended to share them. Writing them down was enough. It made me feel less like a ghost. Every night, I'd check the mailbox even though I wasn't expecting anything. Old habits from years of waiting for bills, letters, tax forms, or maybe just waiting for connection. One evening, I found an envelope from my lawyer's office. Inside was a reminder for my annual review and estate checkup. I smiled faintly. It felt like a nudge from fate itself. Timing, after all, has a way of showing up when truth is ready to surface. At first, I didn't act. I just let the idea sit with me like a seed under soil. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Silence without action turns into surrender. I wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. One night, after another meal eaten alone, I walked past his room. The door was slightly open. He was sitting on the bed, headphones on, watching something on his laptop. The glow of the screen lit his face, a man so far removed from the boy I once knew. For a second, I almost felt pity. Then I remembered the sound of his voice that night. "You can eat from the trash, Dad." That single memory turned my pity to clarity. I went back to my room and opened the drawer where I kept my documents. It was time to remind myself who I was before he made me small. I pulled out the thick folder. The original incorporation papers for the family business, the deed to the house, my bank statements, insurance policies. I laid them all out on the bed. Each one was a chapter of my life, written in ink and effort. As I reviewed each document, I realized something he had never understood. The foundations he was standing on weren't his. They were mine. The house, the business, the savings. Every cent had come from decades of sweat, from calloused hands, from mornings where I'd left before sunrise and returned long after dark. He thought inheritance was a right. but I knew better. It was a privilege earned by respect. That night, I made a list. Names of people who had shown kindness in recent years. An old friend from church in East Nashville, a neighbor who brought me groceries once during a storm, even a nurse from the local clinic who always smiled when she saw me. Strangers had given me more compassion than my own blood. Maybe that's who truly deserved what I had left to give. I spent the next few days gathering my strength, not physical strength, but the emotional kind that only silence can build. I didn't confront him. There was no need. Words would have been wasted. Instead, I practiced the art of patience, the kind that moves slowly, like water carving rock. There's something deeply powerful about deciding quietly. People underestimate silence, but I've learned it's the sharpest blade. It cuts without noise, without warning, without mess. One morning, while he was at work, I took a long walk downtown. I passed Broadway, the bars still half asleep after a night of neon and music, and made my way to the small law office near Church Street. My lawyer, a man named Harold, had known me for over 20 years. He didn't ask many questions when I handed him the envelope. He just looked at me, nodded slowly, and said, "You're ready, aren't you?" I nodded back. We spent the next few hours reviewing documents, updating signatures, and discussing final instructions. I transferred assets, revised my will, and created letters sealed for delivery on a date of my choosing. It was all clean, lawful, irreversible. By the time I left, the sky was painted in the soft amber of late afternoon. I felt lighter than I had in years. On the walk home, I passed the same park where I'd once taught him to ride a bike. The memory rose uninvited, him falling, crying, me running to pick him up saying, "You can do it." He'd looked up at me with such trust. That memory stayed with me all the way back. I realized that was the last version of him I'd ever truly known. The rest had been swallowed by pride. When I returned home, he wasn't there yet. I made myself a simple meal: eggs, toast, a bit of soup. I ate slowly, letting each bite remind me that I was still capable, still alive. After I finished, I cleaned the dishes, wiped the counter, and folded the same dish towel his mother once used. Then I went to my room and sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. That was the rhythm of my new life: quiet, deliberate, unseen. But underneath that silence, something powerful was growing. I had learned that mercy without boundaries is weakness, and I was done being weak. The next steps would come soon enough. For now, I sat in the stillness, breathing in the calm, knowing that the man who had been fed from the bin would soon feed his son something far less filling: his own regret. And I promised myself this: I would not raise my voice again. My revenge would not sound like thunder. It would sound like the turning of a page, the signing of a letter, the closing of a door. In the weeks that followed, the silence between me and my son hardened into something like glass, clear enough to see through, but impossible to cross. I stopped trying to fill the space between us with conversation. Words had become useless currency in a house that no longer understood their value. Instead, I turned inward. I began to build something invisible, something patient. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides quietly behind folded papers, between signatures, within the memory of what belongs to whom. And I still remembered every number, every date, every deal that had built our small world. My son thought he had taken everything: authority, control, pride. But what he didn't know was that his throne sat on foundations I had laid long before his ambition learned to walk. Each morning, I'd make my coffee, sit at the same kitchen table where humiliation had once burned, and go through my files. The business we ran together, our small family logistics company that operated routes across Tennessee, Kentucky, and parts of Georgia, was still legally under my name. When he joined years ago, I'd made him a partner, not an owner. The papers reflected that truth, but he had forgotten it. He'd assumed inheritance was a given, that I was too old to remember the ink that had made him rich. But I remembered. Every line, every clause, every share. I began meeting quietly with my lawyer again, Harold, the same man who'd once handled the incorporation back when I was young and hopeful. His office was downtown, tucked behind an old brick building near Broadway. The same wooden plaque still hung above the door. Harold J. Whitman, attorney at law. He looked older now, slower hands, whiter hair, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. When I walked in, he stood and said, "Well, I'll be damned. You finally came back." We didn't talk long. I didn't need sympathy, just structure. I explained what had happened, leaving out the part about the trash bin. Some humiliations are too private for even a lawyer to hold. I simply told him, I want everything moved quietly. No noise, no paper trails that lead back before the time is right. He nodded, took off his glasses and said, "You're planning something clean, aren't you?" I smiled faintly. "Always have." We spent hours reviewing documents, ownership stakes, transfer rights, corporate filings. It turned out my son's name appeared only as a signatory for daily operations. The controlling shares, the final authority over all assets, still belonged to me. I'd left them that way out of caution years ago. That caution was about to become my salvation. Over the next few days, Harold set things in motion. We filed quiet amendments, shifting control of subsidiary assets into my private holding account. He contacted my accountant in Memphis, a man named Ross, who had always been loyal to me. Within a week, my son's signature privileges on certain accounts were suspended for routine verification. He wouldn't even notice until he needed them. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it because I had finally learned the cost of silence. Mercy without justice only feeds monsters. At home, I kept my routine normal. I still greeted him when he passed by, still made my coffee, still folded my clothes neatly. But beneath that calm rhythm, every breath I took was building toward a quiet reckoning. I began to write letters, not angry ones, but clear, deliberate instructions. One was addressed to my lawyer, another to the board of directors, and one more sealed for my son himself. I kept them in a brown envelope tucked inside my Bible. The letters were my map, my closure, and my last act of control. On the nights I couldn't sleep, I'd walk out to the porch and watch the lights of downtown Nashville shimmer faintly in the distance. I'd sit there with a notebook and think about all the fathers across America sitting in similar silence, men who had given their lives to their children only to become shadows in their own homes. Maybe some of them were watching the same horizon, wondering when love had turned to duty and duty to disdain. Sometimes I'd drive to Shelby Park, parked near the river, and watch the fishermen casting lines into the dark water. I envied their patience. Waiting requires strength. But I realized I'd been waiting my whole life, waiting for kindness, for gratitude, for the sound of my son saying, "Thank you." That day was never coming, so instead, I decided to make sure something else would. I called Harold one final time. "It's ready?" I asked. He replied, "Everything. The accounts, the property, the business. It's all locked under your authority. Only you can release it." That sentence lifted years off my shoulders. My heart slowed, my mind steadied. I wasn't weak. I wasn't forgotten. I was the foundation he had tried to bury, and now I had decided to move. I didn't act right away. I wanted the timing to speak for itself. Life had taught me that revenge delivered too early looks like anger. But if you wait long enough, it becomes justice. During those days of stillness, I watched him spiral deeper into the illusion of control. He bragged about deals he hadn't really closed. He drove new cars bought with money he hadn't really earned. He told his friends that he was running everything now. I'd hear those words from down the hall and feel nothing but a quiet, cold satisfaction. Let him believe it a little longer. Let him enjoy his illusion. In the meantime, I kept documenting everything. Receipts, account statements, board minutes. I made sure every paper trail led cleanly back to me. When you live long enough in this country, you learn one thing. In America, power doesn't come from shouting. It comes from paperwork. Weeks passed like that, silent, steady, meticulous. Until one Thursday afternoon, a letter came addressed to me from the bank. My son's name had been flagged for a pending inquiry. One of the accounts he used for business operations had been frozen pending verification. I smiled faintly and folded the letter neatly. The process had begun. That night, he came home furious, slamming drawers, muttering about errors and bureaucracy. I stayed in my room, pretending not to hear. I didn't need to explain anything. The truth would find him soon enough, and when it did, it wouldn't sound like my voice. It would sound like silence, like doors closing, like the sound of control slipping through his fingers. I spent that night by the window, watching rain slide down the glass in thin, trembling lines. Each drop looked like a small memory running off the pane, years of care, patience, sacrifice, all washing away into the dark. And yet, I didn't feel sadness, only resolve. By dawn, I'd written one final letter, the one that would deliver the final message he'd never forget. I folded it carefully, placed it beside my bed, and whispered to no one in particular, "It's time." Because in the end, the son who once thought he held the world in his hands would soon learn that the world he stood on still belonged to me. And I would remind him, not through anger, but through ink, through law, through the quiet strength of a father who had finally remembered what his silence was worth. That Sunday started quiet. Too quiet, the kind of morning where even the birds outside seem hesitant to sing. Nashville had just come through a storm the night before. The streets were still slick, the sky heavy with leftover clouds. I woke up early, long before my son, and stood by the window for a long time watching the light crawl back into the day. I'd already made my decision, and there was a calmness that came with it. Not joy, not relief, just stillness. I'd spent my entire life reacting to others. Now, for once, I was moving on my own terms. I went to the kitchen and made coffee the way I always did. Black, 1 spoon of sugar, nothing fancy. I could still hear his voice in my head, mocking the way I brewed it, saying it was too old-fashioned. I smiled faintly at that. The same man who couldn't boil an egg without burning the pan was the one who thought my habits were outdated. Life has a strange sense of humor. As the aroma filled the room, I set the table. There was something symbolic about that act. The same table where he had once done homework, where we'd celebrated birthdays, where we'd once laughed until we couldn't breathe. Now it stood between us like a courtroom bench. I laid 2 plates, 2 cups, 2 sets of silverware. I wanted it to look ordinary, routine, just another morning. When he came downstairs, he didn't even glance at me. He muttered something about being busy, grabbed his phone, and walked past. I asked if he'd sit for breakfast before heading out. He hesitated, not out of care, but confusion, as if he couldn't understand why I'd even bother trying anymore. Finally, he shrugged and said, "Sure, whatever." That whatever was his last mistake. We sat across from each other in silence. The only sounds were the faint buzz of his notifications and the clink of my spoon stirring coffee. I looked at him, really looked, and saw a man who believed he was untouchable, a man who thought cruelty came without consequence. His eyes were cold, confident, restless. Mine were tired, but sure. I asked him a few simple questions about work, small talk mostly. He answered half-heartedly, barely lifting his gaze. I could tell his mind was elsewhere, probably on his next deal or his next night out. Every word out of his mouth felt mechanical, rehearsed, distant. And that's when I knew I had chosen the right time. When the plates were empty and the cups half full, I leaned back slightly and studied the sunlight creeping through the blinds. I thought about how that same sun had seen everything, the laughter, the arguments, the long years of sacrifice that had built this house. And now it was watching me take it all back. I told him calmly that I had some errands to run and might be out for a while. He nodded without looking up. That was how much he cared. I could have said I was leaving for good, and it wouldn't have registered. Before I left, I looked at him one last time. Really looked. The boy I'd raised, the man who'd forgotten me, the mirror of my own features carved into arrogance. For a brief moment, I wondered if somewhere deep inside him, there was still a trace of the son I'd known. But then he spoke again, something small, dismissive, and that hope died quietly, like a candle in wind. I walked to my room, took the sealed letter from my desk, and slipped it into my coat pocket. The paper felt heavy, though it weighed almost nothing. It wasn't the ink that made it heavy. It was everything behind it. Every word written with the patience of a man who had endured too much and chosen peace over pity. I left the house without another word. The morning air hit me cold, but clean. The storm had scrubbed the sky clear, and the streets gleamed in the soft light. I walked down the driveway, past the mailbox, and out toward the road. The sound of birds returned, cautious but steady, as if even nature sensed that something final was unfolding. I stopped by the local post office, the same one I'd visited 1,000 times before. The clerk, an older woman with kind eyes, greeted me with her usual, "Morning, hun." I smiled, handed her the letter addressed to Harold's law office, and asked for it to be sent by registered mail. She stamped it, slid it into the outgoing tray, and said, "All set, sweetheart." That was it. My entire revenge, my justice, delivered in silence with a postage stamp. I walked out into the sunlight, took a deep breath, and felt something I hadn't in years: release. By the time I returned home that afternoon, he was gone, probably out running errands or meeting someone. I sat at the table again, poured myself another cup of coffee, and looked around. The house felt lighter, emptier, like it had been waiting for this moment too. I left everything as it was: the dishes, the chairs, even the faint smell of toast still hanging in the air. I wanted the space to hold this memory as clearly as I did. Then, as the clock ticked softly in the background, I packed a small bag. A few clothes, my medication, the keys to my truck, and one photograph. Me and his mother on our wedding day in New Orleans, smiling, full of life. That photo reminded me of who I was before disappointment set in. I didn't leave a note. There was no need. The letter I'd mailed would speak for me soon enough. It held everything: the truth of ownership, the transfer of all assets, the final redistribution of what I had built. By the time he opened it, the business, the house, and the accounts would already be gone. Not lost, redirected. Given to those who knew how to value kindness over entitlement. I took one last walk through the house, touching the walls gently, like saying goodbye to an old friend. Every corner held a memory. The hallway where his laughter once echoed, the living room where we'd built Lego castles, the kitchen that now felt like a courtroom. I paused at the door and whispered softly, "We're done." Then I left. I drove toward the highway, the hum of the tires beneath me steady, like a heartbeat I'd forgotten I had. The Nashville skyline faded behind me, replaced by open fields and long stretches of road. I didn't know exactly where I was going, maybe toward the coast, maybe to stay with an old friend in Virginia, but I knew what I was leaving behind. Not just a house, not just a son, but the version of myself that believed love alone could fix cruelty. As I drove, I imagined him finding the letter, the confusion, the disbelief, the slow dawning of what he'd done. He'd open it thinking it was another reminder, another favor, and then he'd see the words, "You fed me from the trash. I fed you your own regret. Everything you built on my back now belongs to those who still understand compassion." The silence that would follow would be his first lesson in years, the kind that comes too late to change anything. That night, I checked into a small roadside inn outside of Knoxville. The clerk didn't ask questions, just handed me a key with a polite nod. The room was simple: one bed, one lamp, one window looking out onto the hills. I sat by that window for a long time, watching headlights drift by like slow-moving stars. I thought about everything: the decades of work, the meals shared and unshared, the nights of patience, and the final act of resolve. Regret tried to creep in, but I didn't let it. I'd spent too many years living under guilt that wasn't mine. That part of me was gone now, washed away like the rain from the night before. I made myself a cup of motel coffee, weak and bitter, but it tasted like victory. Quiet, honest victory. That was my final meal. Not the food, not the coffee, but the satisfaction that, for once, I had fed my own soul instead of starving it for someone else's comfort. And as I drifted to sleep in that small Tennessee room, I felt peace, real peace. for the first time in years. By the time my son found the letter, 3 days had passed. I know because Harold called to tell me. He said, "It's done." He received it this morning. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need to. I could already picture everything, every reaction, every breath between disbelief and the first wave of regret. He would have come home from work in that same confident stride, still on the phone, still pretending the world revolved around him. The house would have been spotless. He liked it that way now that he had control, or at least believed he did. Maybe he'd noticed my absence, but assumed I'd gone to stay with a friend. Maybe he didn't notice at all. The letter was sitting neatly on the table, waiting for him. It was official, sealed with my signature and the stamp of Whitman and Associates, a law firm whose letterhead could undo entire empires. The sight alone would have made him pause. I imagined him cutting it open with that same careless impatience he always had, expecting maybe a check, maybe a message asking for forgiveness. Instead, he found the opposite. Inside was a single-page letter, short, calm, final. It read, "I fed you life when I had nothing. You fed me waste when you had everything. You thought the home you live in, the company you run, the comfort you enjoy were yours. They were never yours, only borrowed from my years of sacrifice. As of this letter, all of it, the business, the house, the assets, has been transferred to new hands, not out of anger, but truth. People who know the value of dignity will now carry what you threw away. Don't call me, don't chase me, learn from the silence." The second page wasn't written by me. It was an official summary from Harold, notarized, witnessed, and legally binding, detailing the asset transfer. The business ownership was now split between two longtime employees who'd worked there since the beginning. The house had been donated to a local veterans housing program just outside Nashville. The bank accounts, what was left of them, had been reallocated to a scholarship fund for underprivileged youth in Tennessee. Everything he thought defined his power had vanished with one envelope. Harold told me that when he read it, the silence lasted minutes. No shouting, no immediate rage, just a long, stunned quiet, the kind that only happens when a man realizes he's not who he thought he was. Then came the noise, the calls, the arguments, the demands. He called Harold's office 17 times in one afternoon, trying to declare fraud, confusion, mistake. But every signature, every timestamp, every legal document was perfect, clean, ironclad. By evening, he drove to the office himself. I wasn't there, of course, but I imagined the scene clearly, him pacing across the lobby, sweat collecting on his brow, trying to find cracks that didn't exist. The receptionist, a kind woman named Gloria, must have handed him the copies quietly, eyes full of pity. And then, as he flipped through them, line after line confirmed what he feared most. He was no longer in control. When he saw my signature, neat, steady, final, that's when the weight hit. Harold said he sat down heavily in the chair, silent again. For the first time in his life, my son couldn't talk his way out of something. There was no room for manipulation, no one to blame. It was just him and the consequences of what he'd become. Harold told me he eventually said, "He can't do this." To which Harold simply replied, "He already did." I wasn't there to witness the tears, but Harold said they came. Not loud, not theatrical, but quiet. The kind that sting because they arrive too late. The kind that don't come from sadness, but from realization. Later that night, he drove to the restaurant near Nolensville Pike, the one we used to eat at when he was little. I know because the owner, a friend of mine, called to tell me. He said my son sat in the corner booth where we once sat, staring at nothing, his plate untouched. He looked lost, my friend said, like a man whose compass broke. That's when it hit me. The letter had done more than take his possessions. It had stripped him of illusion. In America, especially in cities like Nashville, success often looks like money, cars, business cards, and control. But what people forget is that those things aren't earned. They're sustained by gratitude. When gratitude dies, success rots. And that's what I had fed him that day. Not leftovers, but truth. The taste of humility. The meal of regret. Over the next few days, he must have tried everything. Calling the employees, the bank, maybe even the lawyers of his friends. But the paper trail didn't lie. Every transfer was proper, every record clear, and every move irreversible. Neighbors began to whisper. The man who once bragged about running things was suddenly quiet, avoiding people, skipping the gym, missing meetings. Pride doesn't die loudly. It fades like a slow fever. Meanwhile, I stayed far away. I didn't return to Nashville. I was in Charleston by then, sitting in a small rented cottage near the harbor. I'd wake early, watch the ships roll in, and think about how life moves in cycles, how tides, like power, always come back to balance. I didn't hate him. Hate is heavy. I simply let him face the weight of his own reflection. One morning, a week later, Harold forwarded me an email. My son had written to him, "Tell him I understand. Tell him I'm sorry." I didn't reply. Not because I was cruel, but because I'd already answered. With silence, with action, with that letter. Some lessons aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be felt. That letter became the mirror he had avoided all his life. It showed him the man he had become and the father he had lost long before I ever left. Harold told me that he stopped calling after that. He withdrew from the company entirely, left Nashville, and moved somewhere quieter. Maybe he was trying to start again. Maybe he was running from the past. Either way, I knew the world had finally taught him what I no longer could. As for me, I didn't feel pride, only closure. That letter wasn't revenge. It was release. It was my final act of self-respect in a world that had forgotten what fathers are worth. When I mailed that envelope, I wasn't just ending a story. I was freeing myself from one. And that freedom, I realized, was worth far more than any inheritance, any house, any empire built on ungrateful hands. I had fed my son his own regret, not through anger, not through pain, but through truth written in ink and sealed with quiet resolve. That was my final word. Peace didn't arrive with celebration. It came quietly, the way the morning fog rolls across the Charleston harbor, slow, patient, covering everything it touches until the world looks softer. After everything that had happened, I found myself learning how to live again, not as a father, not as a businessman, but simply as a man who had earned the right to breathe freely. I rented a small white cottage near East Bay Street, just a few blocks from the waterfront. The air there smelled of salt and jasmine, and at sunrise you could hear the distant bells from St. Philip's Church echoing over the water. Every morning I'd take a slow walk down to Waterfront Park, sit on the same bench near the pineapple fountain, and watch people begin their day. Tourists laughed, couples took photos, joggers passed by, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I wasn't someone's burden. I was just a man in a city that didn't ask for anything but presence. My days became simple. I cooked for myself, real food, warm and honest. Sometimes gumbo, sometimes just soup and cornbread. I'd eat on the porch, listening to the faint sounds of jazz floating from a nearby cafe. It reminded me of the days I worked double shifts in New Orleans before moving to Tennessee, when music and struggle danced side by side in the same breath. In Charleston, I started volunteering once a week at a local food shelter near Meeting Street. It wasn't much, sorting cans, preparing plates, cleaning tables, but it filled me with something deeper than pride. Every time I served a meal, I thought about the night my son fed me leftovers from the trash. That memory no longer hurt. It had become a measure. It reminded me how far I'd come from the man who stayed silent to keep peace in a house that had no love left. The people at the shelter began to know me by name. "Mr. Franklin," they'd call out, "the coffee's ready." There was warmth there, the kind that doesn't come from blood, but from shared kindness. One of the young volunteers, a college student from Georgia, once told me, "You've got a calming way about you, sir." I smiled. She didn't know that calmness was built from storms survived. Every evening, I'd walk back to my cottage as the streetlights blinked on. The neighborhood was full of history, cobblestone roads, oak trees with hanging moss, and old houses that had seen generations rise and fall. Sometimes I'd stop at the corner bakery and pick up a loaf of fresh bread, greeting the owner, who always had flour on his hands. Life in Charleston was slower, and that slowness felt like healing. I no longer checked my phone constantly. The silence didn't bother me anymore. It became a friend. There were no messages from my son, no calls from old business partners, no noise of expectation. Just the rhythm of the waves and the occasional laughter from the street below. One morning, I woke to find an envelope slipped under my door. It had no return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. His, my son's. For a long time, I didn't open it. It sat on my table for hours while I made breakfast, fed the birds outside, and watched the harbor slowly brighten. Finally, I broke the seal. Inside was a single page. No excuses, no long story, just a few lines written in unsteady ink. Dad, I saw the scholarship fund. I see what you did. I've been volunteering at a shelter too. I finally understand what food really means. I'm sorry. I hope you're well. I folded the paper and placed it inside the drawer beside my bed. I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. I simply sat there, letting the sunlight hit my hands. Sometimes peace doesn't mean reunion. It just means the world has balanced itself. Over time, I grew older but lighter. My steps slowed, but my mind felt freer than it had in decades. I began writing letters of my own, not to my son, but to myself, reminders of lessons learned the hard way. One of them read, "Never feed cruelty with silence, but never feed peace with revenge." When my hands grew weak, I'd rest them on the table and think of the past, the burns from the labor, the calluses from years of work, the same hands that were once slapped away, insulted, and dismissed. Now they held only peace. Sometimes I'd drive to the edge of Folly Beach at dusk. The Atlantic stretched out endlessly, waves rolling like the years I'd lived, rough, then calm, then rough again. I'd stand there with the wind in my face, knowing the ocean had seen worse than me and still kept moving. The days turned into months, and life became steady, predictable, and deeply satisfying. I didn't own much anymore, a small cottage, a few books, and the quiet certainty that I had lived my truth. People often say revenge leaves you empty, but I learned that real justice leaves space for peace to grow. My son and I never spoke again. And that was all right. Some stories don't need an ending. They just need understanding. As I sit here now, watching the harbor lights shimmer across the water, I feel gratitude, not for the pain, but for what came after it. I lost a son, but I found myself. I lost a house, but I found a home. I lost years, but I gained peace. If anyone asked me what I learned from it all, I'd tell them this. Sometimes the people we love teach us what love isn't. And that's still a lesson worth learning. So, to anyone listening, if you've ever been made to feel small by someone you gave everything to, remember, you still have the power to choose peace. You can walk away, rebuild, and live again. The road may be lonely, but it's yours. I sip my coffee now, looking out at Charleston's sleepy skyline, the breeze soft and forgiving. The world is quiet, and so am I. And in that quiet, I find everything I was looking for. Now, as the years have slowed me down, I sit most mornings by my Charleston window, watching the harbor glow gold under the rising sun. The gulls circle low, calling out to one another, and the water glimmers with that same patient rhythm that life has taught me to follow. Steady, forgiving, unstoppable. I'm no longer the man who once begged for kindness, nor the one who fought for respect. I am something quieter now, something whole. Sometimes, when the wind carries the scent of salt and magnolia, I remember the man I used to be, the father who gave too much and expected love to be its own reward. I used to believe that blood guaranteed loyalty, that if you raised a child with compassion, they'd never turn cruel. But life, especially here in America, teaches a harder truth. Family isn't always built on blood, it's built on behavior. You can't buy gratitude, and you can't beg for respect. You have to walk away from those who refuse to give it. I've lived in Charleston long enough now to see generations pass through the same park benches, the same markets, the same quiet Sunday mornings. I watch young fathers walking their children down East Bay Street, and I smile. They remind me of a time before things fell apart, before pride and greed took over what should have been love. I wish them well. I wish them patience. I wish they never have to learn the same lesson I did. My days are slower now, but full of peace. The small garden outside my window has become my world. I plant tomatoes, a few herbs, and sometimes sunflowers, just to see them lean toward the light. The neighbors wave when they see me tending to them, and that small gesture means more than any inheritance or apology ever could. I've thought often about that night, the one when my son fed me leftovers from the bin. It's strange how a single act can change the course of an entire life. Back then, I thought it was humiliation. Now I see it was revelation. That moment didn't break me. It freed me. It taught me that kindness given to the wrong people becomes a leash. Once I cut it, I learned how to stand tall again. Forgiveness, I've learned, doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing not to let the past poison the present. I forgave him, not because he deserved it, but because I did. I didn't want to carry his cruelty into my peace. And though I never heard from him again after that last letter, I like to believe he changed. Somewhere out there, maybe in a small town in Tennessee, maybe by a diner in Memphis or a church in Georgia, he's serving someone else a meal that's warm, not cold. Maybe he's learning what feeding someone really means. People often ask me why I never went back, why I never tried to rebuild the bond. My answer is simple. Some bridges need to burn so you can see clearly where not to walk again. The fire hurts, but the light it leaves behind is clarity. When I think about my life now, I realize that peace was never about getting even. It was about getting out. Out of the noise, out of the guilt, out of the shadow of people who mistook love for weakness. I had spent too many years trying to fix others when I should have been protecting myself. In this quiet city by the water, I found something I never had before. Choice. The choice to wake up smiling. The choice to eat what I want, when I want. The choice to sit by the harbor without anyone telling me I'm in the way. Freedom isn't loud, it's gentle. It's being able to live your own rhythm without apology. Sometimes at night, I sit on my porch with a cup of tea. Yes, tea, always hot, always mine to pour. And I look up at the stars. The same stars that once looked down on my pain now shine over my peace. The moonlight glistens on the harbor, and I think to myself how strange it is that losing everything can feel like gaining the world. If someone were to ask me now, "Do you miss your son?" I'd say this: I miss who I thought he was. I miss the boy who used to chase fireflies in our backyard, the one who laughed when I carried him on my shoulders at the county fair. But I don't miss the man who forgot where he came from. I can't. Because the moment I stopped missing him was the moment I found myself again. To anyone listening, especially those watching this from small American towns, from quiet living rooms, from nursing homes or porches across Florida, Ohio, or Texas, if you've ever been disrespected by the very people you built your world around, hear me clearly. You still have power. You may not have youth or strength or family beside you, but you have something greater: truth. And truth, when used with calm and patience, is louder than any shout, stronger than any hand that tries to silence you. Your dignity is not for sale. Your worth is not measured by how they treat you. And your love, once refused, can be redirected toward people who need it more. I end every day the same way now, a quiet prayer. Not for revenge or regret, but for grace. Grace to stay calm. Grace to forgive. Grace to continue. So when people ask what my story means, I tell them this: He fed me from the bin to show my place. I fed him regret to show him his reflection. But what I gained wasn't victory. It was peace. And that's the truth I'll leave behind when I'm gone. Not in money, not in a house, but in the simple idea that no matter how cruel the world becomes, you can always write your ending with dignity. As the tide rolls in against the Charleston Pier, I watch the water shimmer under the fading light. Somewhere far away, my son is living his lesson. And here, in my small cottage by the sea, I'm living my peace.